right, thank you. Like Kimberly said, my name is Devon Toland. I actually work on an innovation team up in Enid, Oklahoma at Autry Technology Center. I am not a C# programmer. I'm actually got into Unity just to learn C#, and it sounded a whole lot more fun than any of the more conventional ways. But to start off, just so I have an idea of who all we've got here, about how many people here have downloaded Unity and at least opened it up and seen it? Okay, now how many here have actually sort of built a game or sort of done some builds? Okay, so for my ones who've done a little bit more builds, this is probably going to be fairly basic. We're going to really start from the ground up, going into the user interface, how to set up, how just to get it to your computer in the first place. Okay, so start off, let's just go in. If you don't have Unity already, it's really easy to get to. You can just Google anything. Well, it's of course going to jump in here for me. But if you just go into Google Unity, you can just do download. You can get the beta version, and if you're very comfortable with building in Unity, then feel free to grab that. But I would suggest if you're early on with building, to stick with whatever the current supported version is, which in this point I think we're at 8.2, maybe 14 right now. Because that one's going to be supported. If there's issues out there, they're going to be fixing them, whereas the beta, you're really testing. I mean, you are beta at that point. We're not going to fully download on here, but just to talk about a couple of things you can come in. If you're going to be using this for personal, like I am, and you're really not shipping your games or your projects, you can come in here. Unity is free to come in for beginners. If you're going to be pushing your items out to the Play stores or shipping them or selling them, anything like that, then you do have the Hobbyist or Pro. So just make sure you understand the licensing on those as you go in. When you come in here, you're going to have to tell it that you're not making over $100,000 in your company and a couple other items there. But really the main thing I want to show you here is right after this little accept here. Okay, so at this point, whenever you're downloading, you're really, if you know what you're going to be building to, so if you're going to be building to Android, iOS, if you're going to be building for like AR applications, so forea, this is where you tell those packets to come in. Just be mindful if you're like me and your computer is very limited on available space, that some of these, like the iOS alone, is a couple of gig worth of information. I usually bring in, just as a standard, the WebGL. So if you're going to be putting things out on Twitch, or you're going to be going out trying to go to stream, or you're just wanting to put them out there on some of the free game shares, the WebGL will allow you to build to run in the build all the HTML and everything to run in the background. So again, if you don't grab these, you can come back in later on and grab hold of them, but that's just the one thing I want to show in that download there. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop into Unity. So when we come in here, I think I'm one model release back on here, but as long as you're in 2018.2, your interface should be pretty similar. If you're in 2017, there's going to be a couple little things that are going to be different, but it's very similar. When you come in, of course, you won't see your little list of games here. You'll just have your new button to go into. And with here, just like you do with anything else, that's just finding a spot, set your repo up, some location to hold that. I've got a whole lot of sample games in here, but let's just go ahead and go 11.3. Okay, on the templates, whenever we talk about 2D or 3D, when you're getting in there, this really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. This is just going to set up how your basic layout's going to be when you come in there. But if you start off in 3D and then you want to switch over and start working with sprites in 2D, or if you're wanting to make sort of a 2.5D game to where you're switching back and forth, like Paper Mario or something like that, this is really just setting up your initial preset. So we're just going to start off today in 3D, create a project. I'll let that run in the background, but we're just going to go ahead and hop in. This is going to be where you start off. So every time you start into Unity a new project, it's going to open up a scene, and that scene at a minimum is going to have a main camera and a directional light. And those are considered a game object. So we've got, in here, 5 main screens that we're going to be working in. Over here on the left where you're seeing your game objects, this is called our hierarchy screen. This is where anything that is a physical component within your game is going to reside. All the parenting and the hierarchy to say if you have like a vehicle and you have all the components of the vehicle, they're going to be sort of in a tiered system over here, which we're going to look at here shortly. Your project folder down here is actually going to be basically like your folder explorer. So if we come into here and we say show and explore, we can actually see that within that repo that we have here, I'm in the game in an hour game that I've got put together, and that one, the folders that you're actually working in, that assets, is right here. The other folders, you technically could go through and like your library, and of course I've got some builds, you could delete all those. You could still start your game up, load it up, and it'd rebuild a lot of this. If you're gonna be zipping the file up to send over to someone to play test locally, that's one thing I'd recommend. At the very minimum, delete that libraries folder, because it's a whole lot of space that you're zipping up that you don't have to. Like I said, that'll all be rebuilt. It'll slow down a little bit the first load. But within here, even though we can go in and see, just like right here, we've got build 2. If I go build 2, I can get into this. I wouldn't suggest ever working inside the Explorer itself. You can see there's some metadata files as well as the actual asset file itself. And those, if you start messing with them, you can start getting the link broke between Unity and the files themselves. So I'd always suggest working within your project screen here. That'll keep you keep all your assets where they need to be. Beyond that, our next main screen is going to be in the inspector. So whenever we're working within the game and we click on an object inside the game, you'll see it'll bring up this inspector, which shows us what that item is made up of. And we'll dig into a little bit more about these, what are called components here as we keep going. But the inspector is really where you're going to set all the characteristics of that object. And then also it's where you're going to set up, if you want that game object to be pulled off on code, one of the things you can do is you can come in and add a tag. So this is where you're going to say, you know, I want to pick up item or something else, or I've got a new type of item. I come in here and I can pull those tags out in codes to actually interact within it, within the script, as well as layers as well. Same thing, we've got that. You can think like they've got some preset ones, which are water, user interface, some raycaster items. Those are going to be where, what I use those a lot of times for is, especially in a top-down game like this little sample one here. I've got a layer going on the ground that tells me where my player can walk and where he cannot. So you can notice that little arrow's coming here, but if we come over to this, right now I've got the wall set up as an enemy, but I'm using a layer to actually tell my raycaster where it is that I can click and walk on versus where it is that I have to go in and fight the characters out on there. Okay, so those are our three mains. Then after that, we come into our scene space, which is where we visually build our game. So that's where we're going to come in here, and if we were going to build something new, oh, I childed that to the light. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, there we go. Now we got a cube. So this is where you're going to visually start building your game inside the scene view. Within the scene view, there's a group of controls up here in the top left. These all have quick keys to them. So you've got the Q key, which is your pan. This is just your God mode. You're really not working with your actual game camera at this point. You're just moving yourself around in the scene and working your way to build more items. So let's throw another cube in here. I'll quit childing them and reset. And then we've got the W key, which allows us to move our item, move our transform. The E key, which allows us to rotate. Now, whenever we rotate, we can rotate on the axis. And these are in local space right here, so it's local where the XYZ is. Or we can come up to this button right here and switch this over to global space. Notice we went back to whatever the main game X, Y, and Z coordinates were. And if we move that around and reset again, we can get back to that main. So depending on how you want to rotate those, you can use the local and global space. And that's also true on the move tool. So when we're looking at that, if we take and rotate that, and we switch this back over to local, so this is based on the X, Y, and Z of that game object, versus global, which is based on your actual screen space. Okay. Beyond there, within your scene view, you've also got the rec tool. You're not going to use this too much in 3D. I'm not going to go to it too much. This is going to be more whenever you're working with two-dimensional space or with canvases. So I'd just hop in the Unity docs if you're going to be working in 2D more to work with that. I don't use it a whole lot in 3D, though you can use it. Really, the nice new tool that they released in 2018 is I just call it a multi-tool, but it's the Y shortcut key. This allows you sort of to do everything all in one spot, so I don't have to jump in to rotate or move or anything else. I can just grab right there and do all the different translating I want to do from one tool. Beyond that, you've got your quick snaps for your scene view. If you want to snap to your axis, you can use this, what's called a gizmo up here, your location gizmo, to slide through your locations. And then you can use the center button. I'd suggest if you're using like a Mac and you don't have a third button, I would suggest just at least for while you're working in Unity, if you're going to do it a lot, go and get you a standard 3-button mouse. That way you've got the roller and the click, because that makes navigating in Unity a whole lot easier. You can do it based on trackpads and everything else, but you're really going to hate life if you've got a really large game scene and you're trying to work your way through there. So if we want to zoom in or out, we can use the trackpad ball. Now, if we don't have the ball on there, we can be in the pan tool, hold the Alt key, and right-click on the mouse, and then move left and right to zoom. Or we can left-click to orbit. And we are not tied to our computer scene space, as you can tell. We can just keep running around. I'd say sort of similar with a lot of these UIs. And then one thing that's nice is anytime you're working within the game, if you right-click on the mouse, you'll notice that we're sort of in a first-person view right now. Wherever I move my mouse, it's going. And then also right there underneath the eyeball, you sort of get a hint that you've got more controls. It's showing you the WASD, standard game controls, and that's how I can kind of fly through in first person. This comes very handy whenever you're starting to set your game objects. Or like I've got one game that's, think Star Fox, and I'm flying through the scene space that I have, trying to decide where I want my standard track to be. So what I can do is I can come in here, fly. Okay, yeah, I want my ship about here, so I can go up to Game Objects, go to Align with View. Oh, nope, sorry. Game Objects, Move to View. And then that'll actually bring the game object that I've selected in my hierarchy over to that location, so I can bring it over there. So again, whenever you're working around in a large scene, trying to decide where you want to set some of your assets, this is just a fast way to do it. If you've got a very large scene, this one's pretty small, so I'm going to back up a little bit. Notice if you start getting a scene that's about this space and you start flying around like that, it's going to take forever. You can hold down the Shift key, and then you, see if we can do it without it lagging on me here. Yeah. So you can double your speed up by holding the Shift key. It's a little laggy on us today, but just ways to get around that scene space. Beyond that, if you're going to work in two-dimensional space as well, really our big switch to go from 3D to 2D here is this button right here. Now we're working in a 2D space, and we can go over to our inspector and we can bring in a lot of those other windows, which we'll do here in a moment. But that's why I say it's not too big of a deal whenever you start off if you bring in the different one than what you're going to be doing your main build in, because it's just a matter of switching 2D and then coming up here and saying that you want to go to a 2D setup. So now I've got my tile palette, my animations, all that, and that's really where we would have started off if at the beginning we would have chose 2D instead of 3D. So let's flip back over here. Okay, and then our last one that's in sort of the key areas is the game mode. To look at that, let me hop over to a scene that's got something in it. Okay, so whenever we go over to game screen, this is going to be what your player is actually going to see. Now you're going to see, we have some, or I have some text in here that's being controlled by script once it starts up, so it's got its placeholder text. But if I actually hit play, it's going to go in and switch that back over. It tells me my score is 0, and takes away that win text. You also notice that right now everything's in this really bright red. We'll talk here in just a second about why it is that we want to know whenever we're in games, actually in play mode, because that's going to affect the way we interact with some of our components of there. But beyond the play control, you can also get our game started here one more time. You can pause it, and then you can walk it through scene by scene, which if you've got something like a rain effect or some different effects going on, some particle effects going through into your scene, this is sort of a good way to be able to play through and see what's happening if you've got a little glitch or something like that going through, or if you want to see at what point your colliders, like in this case, we can tell right about there is where our collider's finally picking up to go in. Beyond your standard play controls, you've got your aspect ratio. The only thing I'll say about aspect ratio, a lot of times I'll build early on in free aspect, but if you know you're going to be building to like 4x3, I think we've got for iPad, or let me zoom out here, or we've got 16x10 for your wide screens, or 16x9 for others. If you know what you're going to be building onto early on, I suggest go ahead and setting it. The main thing that's going to do is make it easier on you whenever you go to set up your UI. Because if you start setting up buttons, you're going to set anchors and let them know whereabouts on the screen they're going to be. But sometimes I've found if I start off in that free aspect ratio and I have my screen well zoomed out and I build my UI the way I like it, then all of a sudden when I shove it down to that 4x3, Unity does its best to understand how I wanted those buttons to lay out on the smaller screen, but it'll start to get a little disjointed, and you're going to have to go back and clean those up. So you don't have to set your aspect ratio early on. You're more than welcome to work on free aspect, or if you have a custom one you want, you can come in here and put that resolution in. But that just makes it a little easier, like I say, whenever you're doing your user interface, or whenever you're coming in here to your camera and deciding what its field of view is going to be. Those are all things that if you have your aspect ratio set early on, you can just save yourself some work down the line. Okay, beyond that, the rest of the buttons within play mode are just your maximize on play. So if I wanted this when I started up to, of course, fill the screen up, then maximize on play would do that. I can come right in here and exit back out of that maximize. And we've got then our gizmos. So gizmos are anything that's inside your scene, it's inside your hierarchy, that's not a physical item. So like our light source, that light source isn't a physical thing. It's just something that we're going to use to control the angles of what is our fake sun, or if we've got a flashlight or something like that. If we had a lot of sound files and animations and things like that sitting on this little player ball here, then those would also be showing up on the gizmos. And you can control what level you see on that. And then if you've got a large game that's doing quite a bit of pull on the system, you can come in here and see the stats of your game in play and go through and do some optimization work on that. Okay, so those are really your main 5 screens, though, of the system that pretty much no matter what game you're working in or what build, whether it's a game or something else, you're going to be working in. Beyond that, there's the console screen, which is just your general console log, so for doing debugging or anything else. If for any reason you want to reset this up, these are all just dockable screens. We can go and start just moving things around wherever we want them. You don't have to worry too much about it, because if you like the default, you can always go over here, just reset, or you can come in here after you get it to the way you like and save you a new one. Like I've got a 2-screen layout here. I've got my game mode in a separate one versus where my scene layout's going to be. And you just come in here once you have your scene sitting where you like, hit save layout, call that what you like it. If for some reason you're in here and you don't see one of the pieces that you're needing, like say I needed the sprite editor, we could just come into the Windows and go into whichever section. The general, the 5 we're talking about are all sitting in the general, or you've got your 2D, so we've got our tile palette there. And then you can just bring that in, dock it to the location on your screen you want, or have it free floating. And of course we can close those out as well. Okay. So now let me see where we're at here. I think we're going to hop into the little build a card demo. Yeah. First off, any questions just on the general UI layout and any of those controls? Okay. Okay, so let's hop into create a new scene. So Unity, your game is going to be made up of scenes. Whenever you come in on Unity 2018, it makes you what's called a sample scene. So you're always going to be starting off basically at this level right here. And then you can come in and create new scenes. Whenever you start off with a blank game file, which we've got, let's just hop into this one here. This is basically where you're going to start off. You're going to start off with a folder with the scenes subfolder that's called sample scene. Within there, then you just start adding your game objects and assets. So we're just going to do a quick demo of building a simple sort of blocky roads car here. Whenever we want to add a new space item to our screen, we can come over into our hierarchy and right-click, or we can go up into Game Objects and 3D Objects. I'm just going to work in the hierarchy here. 3D Object, Cube. That is going to center it basically to where you're looking. So one of the things that I usually do when I come in here is hit the reset on the transform in the top right. That'll just reset it all to 0, 0, 0, reset your all your rotation on it, get you back to where you want to be. So we're going to grab our stretch tool here and Okay. At this point, I could go ahead. I'm going to add a cab to the little box of this car. I could come in here, right-click like we just did in 3D, but I'm actually going to work with the one that's here, and I'm just going to hit Control-D. And that's going to duplicate. If we would have called this cube 0, as long as we follow this naming convention, it'll keep incrementing them those for us. But now we've got sitting here, second little car top. Let's pull that in, pull it in. Okay, don't judge me on my car. It's going to be pretty blocky. All right, let's bring in a cylinder, and let's rotate it around the 90. Oh, let's try rotation, not position. So I could grab it and do the, maybe. There we go. I could grab it, go E, and try and move it around here. But I really want to get it right at 90, so I'm just going to come in and type in 90 degrees. Get it back to where I can see it here. Let's bring it down. And let's get it about where we want it to go. Okay, I'm going to Control D, or I could have right-clicked and duplicate on there. Yep, that looks good. Control D both those, just held down Control to select them both. And now I've got 4 wheels and a very pretty looking car right here. I mean, that's my best work, I think, today. Okay, so this is where we start to get into the idea of, well, now maybe I want to move this car across here. So I'm going to click on it and move. Well, that's not going to work very handy because I'm going to have to keep on coming in here and either for whatever reason, Control Z is not working today, but that's all right. I can come in here and grab all my little game components, or I can go select them on here. But really what we want to do at this point, these pieces are all one game object. They're a car. So we want to go into our hierarchy, and we want to create an empty item. We're going to rename this car. And then I'm going to go through, hold down Shift, select all those, and just drag them right inside of this car. So now I have a parented object, call a car, and I can move that around. I can scale it. I can rotate it however I want to do on there. No Z. But I can work that as well. The other thing I can do is I can put a piece of code. I can come in here and add a piece of script. So we'll just say my script. And now I'm working with a piece of script that's affecting the entire game object. I could be coming down here, and maybe I just want to make the wheels turn, and coming into these cylinders, which I was just calling wheels, or some tire or something like that. And I could just put a piece of code on those individually. So maybe I want a front-wheel drive tire, so I'm going to put or front-wheel drive vehicle, so I can put 2 code files on each of those. Or I could have come in and tagged the tires as front tire, back tire, left tire, right tire, and called those out in code. But anytime you're working with script, it's going to have to be attached to a game object. So we can't just we could come down here and build this C-sharp right here called my script 2. We could write all this really nice code in here to tell our game what all it's going to do, but if it is not attached to something in our hierarchy, it's never going to be called on. It's just going to keep on going out there. Now you can, of course, call your script out through other ones' script, but if you're just wanting it to be like a player controller where you're saying if I hit W, move the transform forward or apply force, those type of calls are going to need to be setting somewhere on your scene. A lot of times if you're doing something like music, you can just attach those to your main camera and then just tell it not to destroy your camera in between scenes. But it doesn't really make as much of a difference which one it's on as long as it is somewhere on there. Okay, so that's really good, but now I want to set up a whole screen here of basically a little traffic jam. So I could come in here as we've done and hit Control D on this car. W, move it out, Control D again. Control D. And start building this out, which that works. Now the other thing is I realized I just sort of put this in a weird spot. I really want it up here because I want it to look more like a truck. Well, the problem is now I'm going to have to come into each one of these. So that's where we get into what's called a prefab. So if we back up here, hey, Z's going to work for me now. If we back up here to where we've got just our original car, if I know that I want to make a lot of versions of this car, I can come down in here and just grab a hold of it and drag it into my project screen, and that just builds what's called a prefab. You see all the components that are that make up this car are sitting here in a prefab state. Now, I could have done this with my ground, like in the other game we've got sitting over here, and we come back to look at the mini game, and I go back into my prefabs. You can see the ground is prefabbed, all these little cubes are prefabbed, the wall itself is prefabbed. What that allows us to do is to work with instances of the car. So now, this car up here is an instance of this prefab. If I come into this prefab and I say rotate it 90 degrees, oh, well, 90 is not the best degree. Let's scale it up. So as I'm working on it, it's working with that car on here. Now also, if I come in here and either hit Control D and make another one, and then I go to scale something on it, oh, go back to the prefab. Oh, don't make a liar out of me now. Oh, because I broke the prefab. If you go off and change the prefab inside the screen, you're making a new instance of it. So whenever I hit Control D here and then change its scale, I broke its tie to the prefab. So now that these are both actually tied to the prefab, we can see whenever we're working with it, it's actually going to work across all items in the scene. Now, like what I did right there was I came in and I changed the scale of this on the X. So as you notice, the scale position, a lot of these things just turn dark black. It's sort of hard to tell, but right in there, those are dark black right now versus these light. If they're light, that tells you that they are attached to the prefab. So if I do something with the Z scale, it's applying to both. Whereas if I look back at that instance, we can tell the X scale is now dark. I'm not going to work on that because it's saying that I have said on this instance that I want it to be unique. Now, if I wanted that not to be unique, I wanted that to be how the prefab was, I can come in here and hit apply, and there we go. That now just went to every version of that, took my giant car here. Let's move them down away from the camera. But that took and made it to where all the cars that are attached to that prefab are done that. Now, if I also went through and I said, okay, I shrunk this car down, and actually I don't like that. I like the way I had it before. I can come in here and revert that and bring that back. So prefabs are a fast way to be able to work with get a standard blueprint of different game objects in your game, and be able to put script on them, come in, put colors on them. So if we wanted to create what's called a material, we could come in here and say blue. And we'll go to our albedo and grab blue. Get off our alpha scale there. And then now I could take this down and just put this on this individual car. Or I could come through, let's see if it'll let me do it right now. There we go. I can drop it on its game component in here and go across. Now the other way I could have done that was, of course, going to one of my instances, and after I put that color on there, go ahead and hit apply, and that sends it back to the prefab. It's one of those deals where if you've got a lot of enemies in your game, or you've got a whole lot of different items on there, they're going to be working with versions of them. Prefabs will save you a whole lot of time. The thing to be careful about it is, though, if you're working with a prefab and you've put some instances out there in the game, just understand you are going to be working on them across scenes. This isn't the prefab for this current scene I'm working in, it's for all the levels of the game. So unless you go off and purposely break those prefabs, if I come in here, do that with this, oh, I got two cars sitting on top of each other, and I want this to be its own style from now on, I can come in, grab a hold of this car, drag it in here, and now I've got two different types of prefab. So I've got car and car one here. So now whenever I start doing stuff to this on different items like the XYZ, it's not going to affect across. Okay. Now working with our game objects, I think we've got most of that. Just a quick conversation though about game objects versus components. Whenever we look at something in our game, basically if it's in our scene space, it is a game object. Anything on this left-hand side, including your camera, your directional light, anything that's in there. Every game object is built up of what's called components. That's your right-hand side here. At the basis of any game object, even if it's like these walls, which is just a holder, empty game object, it's going to have a transform. That's its location and scene space. Then beyond that, if it's something you can physically see in the game, you're going to have a transform and a mesh renderer. But say that we had our player here and we wanted to have a level in the game to where whenever he crosses over this bonus level, he can't see his player object anymore. Maybe it's just a light floating around out there. We can control these components from script. So we come in here and control this little toggle and say the mesh renderer active is false. It's still going to be playing the game the exact same way. We'll see what the chances are I can actually hit something here. So if we go over, see, we're actually still a player in the game. We're just now a very awful game of trying to figure out where in the world I'm at. But anything you've got that's a component on the side, that is going to be a editable item in code. The Unity docs have really good documentation on all that. If you click on this little notebook over here, that will take you to the Unity docs on the game object, or I'm sorry, on the game component. That's not really going to get you into the scripting references, but that's going to tell you a lot of the properties. You'll need to actually go into the scripting references within the Unity docs to get how to call those out in code. But that'll give you a lot of, what all the different levels are here. The next thing you're going to work with pretty much all game objects are some form of collider. If you want something in the world to be able to interact with it, it's going to have a collider. For the ball itself, I want it to be physical, so I want it, whenever it hits a wall, I want it to stop moving. I want it to bounce off that wall. So I have a full collider on it, as well as a collider on these walls here as well. Now, but that's different whenever we come and look at our collectible items. I want my player to go through it, but I don't want him to hit that collectible item and throw it across the screen. I want him to, whenever he touches it, it just send off a notification to my code to let me know, hey, I'm interacting with it. So that's where you get this isTrigger. So isTrigger makes it to where we can come over into our code and say, on trigger enter. Now we can do this on collision as well, but again, you hit that, you actually have that physical, you're going to have that split second where the item's going to move. So a lot of times if you're doing something like collectible, you're going to do trigger. So we got this on trigger enter. Remember we talked about tags a little bit earlier. I said on these tags, if they have a tag of pickup item, then go through to the other game object that I just collided in, set active to false, so we just sort of hide it off the screen, but we can recycle that asset, so we're not having to rebuild these every time we go through and touch them if we want to come back in, increment their score, and also increment, check and see if they've won the game. So triggers are something that you'll use quite a bit, or if you want them to, as they walk through a door, to trigger going into some sort of animation happening or loading the next scene, you can have those invisible tripwires out there for them to start a piece of your code going. Beyond that, if you want, the next main thing you're going to use with everything is going to be a rigid body. So if you want gravity or any type of forces to work on it, you're going to have a rigid body in here. And again, you've got controls like how much mass is going on it. You can go like the player object here, I think, yeah, I've got him froze on the y-axis because I do have his speed sitting here in script as a serialized field. So I can come in here and set that speed to 100. And if I didn't have him locked on the Y, whenever he slammed that wall, most likely that ball is actually rolling. It's going to, let's just crank that up even to 1,000. He's going to most likely fly over the sides. He's going to roll across there. So I don't want that to be a possibility. So I went into his rigid body and I froze him on the Y-axis. Now with this, since I'm using a sphere with forces, I don't want to freeze his rotation because at that point, I should just have a stationary ball. Nope, he's trying. He's still lagging around there, so he's still not doing too bad. But you're going to find some of your gameplay is going to get a little weird with rolling if you start freezing those axes. Okay. How are we doing? We're doing all right on time. Okay. Let's hop into a little bit of the canvas and UI. So as we saw whenever we hit play on here, or actually before that, let's talk about why this turned red. So as you saw a second ago, I don't know if you caught it, but I switched this over to 1,000 on my speed here, and then when I hit play and took that off, my speed went back to 10. So in play mode, whenever you're working in it, keep in mind, you don't want to sit there and accidentally work in that for half an hour. I've done it, because everything you just did is erased as soon as you uncheck that play button. So you can come into your edit and preferences, go to colors, and you have a play mode tint, and we can set that, and this, I would not normally do this crazy of a, hey there, that's a little bit more subtle. But you can set that play mode tint in here, just something that'll trigger you to know that, hey, I don't want to keep working in on these components on there. Now, there's an exception to that rule of that what you do inside of play mode does not come across, and that is if whatever you're working with is an asset in the game. So when I say that, if it exists down here, so if we go into our materials, you'll see I have a yellow material here. Well, if I come over to my collectibles, and let's just select one of those, and I go down to its shader, and I grab that material, and I say, well, I'm going to switch that to red. Notice it's actually going to the project file that's sitting out there in our Explorer and changing that. So whenever we come in here and come off of that change stayed. My yellow is now red. So just understand that anything you're working with that's in a component, if it is tied back to a physical asset in your Explorer, that is going to stay whether you're working inside a scene space or not. The other thing is if you do get in here and you find, well, I hopped back over to scene mode and I really like my player to start right here, but I just did that in the gameplay. I can grab a hold of the transform, or I can grab a hold of whatever game object it was I made a change to, or whether it was the render or anything else. I can click on the little settings button right here, copy the component, unclick play, click on that again, and paste component values. The thing to keep in mind with that is you get to do that once. So if you do a whole lot of moving around, you're going to be handwriting out a lot of those component changes and transferring them over. So just one way you can get across them there. But now back to our canvas. So as we see here, we've got the score 0. Canvases are sort of a strange thing to me in Unity. It's actually sitting here on our screen. I don't know if you sort of noticed it. There's this nice big white line. If you're going to work with the user interface, I suggest switching over to 2D. And let's go into a screen that does not have a canvas yet, just sort of show you, bring that in here. So if I were going to enter in any type of text for the user to see or a button for them to see, I'd right-click in the hierarchy, go UI, and go to, we're just going to go text. Now notice that brought in a few things. That brought in an event system and a canvas. Any type of user interface text is going to be residing in a canvas. So if you go off and delete either one of those, it's going to break your UI. So keep in mind that those are going to pop in there. Leave them be, they need to be there. But at that point, I'm going to switch over to 2D. I'm going to double click on my canvas, and that way I can sort of zoom in here and work with what's going to be. Now, like I said, my game's still sitting right down there in the corner, but this is just sort of how Unity does it. It gives you this sort of overlay here. Now, whenever we go to that text, really the main thing I wanted to point out that took me a while to figure out how in the world to do this was how to get this thing not to keep moving around my screen and getting it to lock in to where I wanted it. The trick is whenever you click on that text or button or whatever it may be, to click on the anchors over here, hold down your Shift and your Alt key, which you'll see that right here, Shift for the pivot, Alt for the positioner, and now I can go top left, top right. You know, I've got sort of my 9 squares here that I can work in, and then I can sort of move the position a little bit off if I want to offset it from the side a little bit, and actually we'll go 50. So that way my text now, whenever I go into play, is going to be sitting right there, and if I change the aspect ratio, it's still going to be trying to figure out about where I want it, but it's always going to stay in that section of the screen there. Okay, and switch back over to our main one here. Okay, so now that I've gotten done with my 2D, I switch here and switch back over. I could come in here and keep just zooming in to try and get to where I go. Or there's a couple of quick ways to get around. One way is just double click on your hierarchy. It'll bring you to whatever that item is. The other thing is if you're just sort of backed out here and you can see the item you want to go to, if you'll click on it and hit the F key, that'll also quick snap you to its location. Okay, so let's jump out of that and actually switch over to a little bit of script review really quick. Talk about some of our common namespaces. Let's hop into Mr. Rollerball here. And let's hop onto our player. Ooh, 2D. There we go. Okay. Okay, so with our script, I showed a little bit earlier of how to add a script file. Anytime you want to add a component of any sort, you can just come in here. If you start typing something and it doesn't understand this thing, it's going to just automatically assume you're wanting to create a C# script file that is whatever you were typing in. So if you just start typing whatever you want your new file to be called, do that. You can say create and add. It's going to go through, compile the code for you, and it's going to get those, switched me over, but didn't actually open. There we go. It's going to start you off right here. We've got a new public class of this thing, monoBehavior, and you're always going to start off with a start and update. Now, there's a lot of different versions of update. There's a fixed update. There's a late update. I would suggest going on to, really you can just Google it, but if you just go find the monoBehavior flowchart, it's not going to render up with the names. monoBehavior. But as you go to work with things like moving the player, if you're wanting to happen after the graphics have been rendered in the scene or before the graphics have been rendered, you can sort of choose that based on what type of update you're working with. See if this gives us. Yeah, that gives us the text version. There's an actual graphical representation of this as well in Unity docs. But that'll take you through, which one of those you'll want to work with. Most of the times, especially early on, update by itself works just fine. It's going to be more whenever you go into game optimization that you're going to start really having to look at which ones of those you use. But your standard Unity namespace that's going to come in on every one is Unity Engine. The other two namespaces I'd say that you're going to want to get really familiar with are going to be using your Unity Engine.ui. So if you want to work at all with that canvas or with that text out there through script, you're going to have to pull in the UI namespace. And the other thing is, there's a couple ways you can build games in Unity. One would be to have one giant level that's all in one scene, and you have gates such as they jump off a cliff and they can't jump high enough to get back, or maybe you have waypoints, so whenever you hit here, you load to the other. That's one way. To me, that's a little hard to manage because you're jumping all over a very large scene space. The other item is to make multiple levels through scenes. And if you're doing that, you're going to need to be able to go from scene 1, scene 2, understand what scene you're currently in, jump through the levels, and that's where scene management comes in. So these are two namespaces that almost every game, or really three, but two sub namespaces that almost every game you're going to be working in. There's also a asset pack out there from Unity, and we'll look at that store here in just a second, called Standard Assets, and it's got some extra namespaces out there that you can pull in that aren't just out of the box ready for you to use, but it's got a lot of your general controls. It's got some AI controls, so if you want to put a opponent out there and have him come and attack you, you can do that really just by dropping some of their pre-built script in there and then just defining your player and what spaces the AI can run on. Beyond there, I think most of y'all, it sounds like, are probably pretty familiar with C# code. I prefer to use serializeField if I'm going to surface up something. So if I'm going to be building the script and I have someone else that is either going to be doing the UX, sort of the player experience, or if I'm just going to be shipping out to some friends to say, hey, play this, and you can change how fast your character moves, how much their animation speed is. If I want to surface some of those, I do it through serializeField. A lot of the code you're going to see out there, samples, are public. And if you look in Unity docs, and in my opinion, there's not a whole lot of times you need public variables in Unity because you're not really trying to have other code call on it. You're not trying to make it public for the code. You're just trying to surface it for that user to go through and do some defining of the user experience. So both of them work the same. Whenever I come in here and serialize a float, and I come over to my game itself, right there we can see if I went back and added a new one here of serializeField. Float. We'll get there. Float this one. And save. Let it recompile here really quick. Really quick-ish. There it is. So now we've got our new this one on here. So I can open that up for the player to work with. Again, like I say, most of the code out there you see with a lot of code examples use public. My personal preference use serializeField, but you can each your own on those. But whenever I'm building a game out, anything that I want to control something as the player experience, I try and serialize those so I can give them out to people and let them sort of change it. Because you can make a game a lot different if you take an animation and you let someone jack it up about 50 times its regular speed, and all of a sudden you have a little character like Ethan, the guy we saw running around the screen a second ago, with his legs running 90 miles an hour and just sort of crawling across the screen. Sometimes letting people do extremes in there, you get a whole different type of game experience. The next thing we're going to be working with quite a bit is get component. So we talked about this code is sitting on a game object. That game object is made out of multiple components, the simplest being the transform. If I want to work with those components in the code, I need to go get them. So like the rigid body, I want to apply forces to it. So I'm going to instantiate it right off the bat. I'm going to say I want a private rigid body. I'm just calling mine rigid body. We could have called this whatever we want. And then from there, once the game starts up, I'm going to take the game object I'm currently working on, grab the component of type rigid body. Now where this comes into a little trickier is if you're doing something like a box collider, and say you've got a box collider for the cab and a box collider for the main body of the vehicle. If you're working with vehicle again, you're going to have to do it a little bit different. But as long as you're just working with a single component, such as a rigid body, which each item is going to have one, you can do that right through your get component. And then at that point, then we can come in here and type in rigid body. And then we've got all the different things we can do to manipulate that rigid body. And of course, this is all very well documented on the Unity docs. In this case, I'm going to add a force based on the movement, which is tied to a vector 3. If you're working in three-dimensional space, you're always going to be working with vectors 3. That's your x, y, and z. I'm saying take the horizontal input, which is already predefined in Unity. They'll have up here in our file input, edit, project settings inputs. Here's your basics of if you want to know, if I call out horizontal in code, that's telling me it's the left mouse button, the A key on there. It's got all its mappings on here. If you're working with something like a Xbox remote controller, which it supports right out the bat, then you can come out into here and you're going to be working with your with the axis. So if we go into, right here. So this is where you start defining your joystick controls and everything like that on the axes within those. But on here, I'm just taking those and saying, okay, go look for the person to hit one of the horizontal keys or the vertical keys, map that to the X and Z, and don't have any movement happening, any forces happening on there, and apply that as a force times the speed that we've got up there. Colliders we already talked about a little bit. We could have a on collision enter and an on collision exit. So if we want to say that whenever we hit something, nothing happens, but whenever we bounce off of it and we stop touching it, it shoots across the screen. We do have an exit just like we have an enter on these. And then whenever we look at our scene manager, we've got our load scene. I'm just taking a current scene that I grabbed right at the beginning of the on play. And somewhere in there. Yep, there it is. And I'm just saying increment by 1. Once you get in there and play with it a little bit, it's pretty self-intuitive. You just hop into the Unity docs. If you're using mono development, I personally use Visual Studios, but if any of y'all use mono development or the mono developer or something like that, the nice thing with it is you can come in here, highlight, and hit Control. I think it's Control asterisk, and it'll pop you straight into the Unity docs for that component. So you can actually get to all the text references in there. That is the only thing that I really like about that compared to working in Visual Studios. So beyond that, the last thing we're going to talk about here is how to build out. So okay, I've got my game. I've got 2 levels sitting in this game. I want to build this. So I can go into File, Build Settings. This is where what I chose at the very beginning when I downloaded this matters. So I've got PC, Android. If I've got Android, usually they might change in 2018. I haven't built on 18 yet, but usually it's going to ask you where all your SDK and everything is at for that. But if we're going to build on standalone, we come in here, and whenever we first start off, it's going to look like this. If we just hit build right now, whatever the current open scene is the only thing that's going to be built into our game. So if we've got multiple levels, we won't grab those. What we need to do instead is I'm going to grab these two scenes here, just drag them in. The ordering does matter. If it's 0, it's going to be the one that starts off. And then, of course, 1 is going to be your next level. And we're just going to hit build. I'm going to go to this builds folder and this build. This is going to form my exe file. Oh, well, yeah. It's just wanting to know where I want to put it. Let's back up there. Builds. Okay. We'll give it a second. If it does not wrap up in just a second, I'm just going to go ahead and get it opening on the build I did earlier. Oop, it might be going. Okay. So we've got game in an hour exe. Play. We did not build the game in an hour, but we're going to look at the game in an hour. Okay, so at that point, I've got here this game. I can come in and see how quick I can get all the little... No, missed it. Come on. See what my ball rolling skills are here. I won that level with the score of 12, and now I loaded level 2. So I come in here, and that's sort of the basic build out of it. Now see, I did not make my aspect ratio, so it just took up my entire screen. Okay. But that's the basic build process. It'd be the same if you're going to that. I mean, if you're going Android, you'd have to go and build your canvas to probably have your up, down, left, right controls, get your joystick on there, build that user experience side. But beyond that, you can build, I built to HoloLens from here, doing Google Cardboard builds. There's a whole lot of angles you can go with Unity, even if you're not doing game development. We've used some for our school just in just some general builds. Any questions on all that? I know that everyone's got lunch breaks they're wrapping up on. Want to respect your time, and I'm going to be around afterwards for questions as well. So, we good? Okay, and I'll turn it back over to you.